Peter, I want to start with you because tell us what the options are for the president to try to rein in his counterpart, Vladimir Putin.
Well, Betty, the options aren't great, but he does have options here, and it's pretty clear from listening to administration officials over the weekend they don't include a military response. That seems off the table at this point for sure. The strategy basically highlight the risks and the cost to Vladimir Putin, show strong support for the new government in Ukraine, including financial support. That's why we see John Kerry going to Kiev tomorrow, and then offer Putin an off-ramp out of this crisis. Give him an exit strategy. First, here on the costs. Again, senior U.S. official over the weekend making the case that it's Putin who has miscalculated here. That's the White House sales pitch right now. The Russian economy vulnerable in their view. The drop in the ruble a reflection of that right now. And Kerry in his tour of the Sunday talk shows mentioning again, highlighting there will be more pain to come unless Putin backs down.
He's going to lose all of the glow that came out of the Olympics, his $60 billion extravaganza. He is not going to have a Sochi G8. He may not even remain in the G8 if this continues. He may find himself with asset freezes on Russian business. American business may pull back. There may be a further tumble of the ruble. There's a huge price to pay.
Now, of course, we had to imagine, does Vladimir Putin see it that way right now? The other threats out there, Betty, that Kerry didn't mention directly, WTO membership, the possibility, again, of sanctions and asset freezes, maybe sanctions involving banks. That would be painful. And then there's the off-ramp, the motivation to Putin to change his mind here, the offer of international observers to safeguard Russian interests and the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. That's the pretext that Putin has used so far for this action. If you can assure Putin that those things aren't at risk, then maybe, just maybe, he will back down. He didn't close the door on that, according to senior U.S. officials in his conversation with President Obama over the weekend, but he also clearly, Betty, hasn't embraced it as well.
All right, Peter, just hang with me for a moment. I want to turn to Richard now. Richard, you know, I read one disturbing detail, though, in all the phone calls back and forth between the president and other leaders around the world, including Chancellor Angela Merkel, who said to Obama that Putin seems a little bit not in this world right now, that he's a little bit out of reality. I mean, all of those options might work. However, are we dealing with somebody who is thinking rationally?
Well, we haven't heard a lot from him directly, but I do think he is rational. He just operates in a very realpolitik, zero-sum world, which, frankly, most of the rest of the world has moved on from. I don't think any of the measures that Peter just laid out that the United States could do will move him. I mean, I don't see an effective coercive strategy here. He cares more about it than we do, by a lot. And these economic sanctions that we're talking about usually, historically, really only work on smaller countries that are more dependent. This is a very large economy. And yes, it is predominantly dependent on oil and gas exports for its foreign currency, but I don't see the European Union agreeing to embargo, for instance, 30% of their gas supplies. I mean, I think the Germans will walk away from that. It's easy for President Obama, where the United States does very little trade with Russia. The Europeans do a lot of trade with Russia, and sanctions
hurt them too. So it's hard for them to go along with that. So what would work? What could work?
In this case, I don't see us coercing him out of this. I also don't see us talking him out of this in some way. He's not going to suddenly have a revelation and say, oh boy, I made a mistake. I really didn't mean to do this. Where I think you may go is some sort of diplomatic settlement between Russia and the new Ukrainian government and whatever's in Crimea, where Crimea achieves a higher level of autonomy than it already has, short of annexation by Russia. I think it would be very provocative for Russia just outright annex as part of a foreign country. But they may be able to get something in between, sort of an autonomous entity, possibly an independent country that is effectively controlled. I mean, Peter pointed to one of the examples. There's a little part of northern Georgia called North Ossetia. The Russians did invade Georgia to carve it out. It's now sort of theoretically its own country, but really run by Russia.
Peter?
Well, I just want to pick up on what Richard was talking about and get his take on whether or not Putin's going to be satisfied with just control, if you will, effective control of Crimea. What about the prospect, Richard, that this goes, that the Russians move, when we hear they're right over the border, they've got units right over the border, they were having these exercises, they go into other parts of eastern Ukraine. Doesn't that change this dynamic substantially?
So that would. So I think it's important to remember that the Russians had forces in Crimea already. They were around the Black Sea Fleet, which is based in the city of Sevastopol. And so those forces that you're seeing on the news right now were actually already in Crimea. What you're talking about is bringing in new forces through eastern Ukraine from Russia into Crimea. That would be a provocation and an act of war, and is the sort of thing that could lead to a shooting incident if the Russians try to force their way in. There currently is no other land bridge into Crimea except one through Ukraine.
Peter, you know, as we mentioned with Secretary Kerry going to Kiev, what does he hope to accomplish there?
Well, he wants to get a really nice photo op with all the leaders of Ukraine to show U.S. support for them. And I think, Betty, we're also talking about a financial role here for the United States. Do not be surprised if John Kerry offers more details on exactly what the United States and perhaps the IMF to follow might be prepared to do to bolster this government in the short term. We've had Secretary Lew talking about it over the weekend as well. This is the most immediate short-term help that the United States can provide, besides rhetorical help and besides these threats, and that is money. And again, I would watch for that as well when John Kerry's in Kiev.